You know, I had a conversation recently that stopped me in my tracks. Someone came to me, successful, accomplished, genuinely impressive human being, and they said, I've built everything I set out to build. I'm exactly where I wanted to be. So why does everyone keep asking me when I'm going to find someone, like my life doesn't count until I do? And I looked at them and I wanted to say something that nobody seems willing to say out loud. What if they're right? What if the most powerful thing you could do, the thing that would actually unleash your greatest potential, is to stay single? Not because you're broken, not because you're afraid, but because you understand something that most people have been carefully taught not to see. There's a pattern in history that nobody talks about. The individuals who bent reality to their will, who created works that outlived empires, so many of them walked alone. Not by accident, by design. And the question isn't why they stayed single. The question is why we've been so thoroughly convinced that this path is somehow lesser, somehow incomplete. Because once you understand what solitude actually gives you, what it unlocks in the architecture of your existence, you'll see that the real trap isn't being alone. The real trap is the one they've been selling you since childhood, wrapped in white lace and promises of completion. So let me take you through something, not to convince you to leave your partner or to reject love, but to show you what sovereignty actually means. And why, for some people, for the ones who see clearly, staying single isn't a consolation prize. It's the grand prize itself. There's a story from ancient Greece that haunts me. Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, master of armies, ruler of an empire that stretched from Greece to India, sought out a philosopher named Diogenes. He found him living in a barrel, owning nothing, beholden to no one. Alexander stood before him, casting a shadow over the old man, and said, I am Alexander the Great. Ask me for anything and it shall be yours. And Diogenes looked up at this man who commanded nations and said, yes, move a little to the left, you're blocking my sunlight. Now, the story usually ends there, with Alexander marveling at Diogenes' indifference to power. But there's something deeper happening in that moment. Alexander reportedly said afterward, if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. Think about that. The most powerful man in the world, envying the freedom of a man who owned nothing and answered to no one. What did Diogenes have that Alexander, with all his empire, could never possess? He had sovereignty over himself. Complete, uncompromised, undiminished sovereignty. Alexander went home to palaces and wives and obligations. He spent his evenings managing the emotions of generals, negotiating with rivals, maintaining the vast machinery of power. His time was never his own. His mind was never quiet. He was trapped inside the empire he'd built. Diogenes went back to his barrel. His time was his own. His thoughts were his own. Nobody needed him to be anything other than what he was. Now, here's what the world won't tell you. They'll tell you that Alexander won because he conquered nations. They'll tell you that having a partner, a family, a conventional life is winning. But they never ask the question that matters. Who was actually free? Who actually owned their life? And this pattern, this strange truth, it repeats throughout history. The people who changed everything, who created lasting works, who pushed human understanding forward, so many of them guarded their solitude like it was sacred. Because it was. Nietzsche never married. Schopenhauer never married. Tesla never married. Emily Dickinson never married. Beethoven, Da Vinci, Newton, Kant, the list goes on. And the world looks at this and says, well, they were lonely. They were damaged. They couldn't make relationships work. But what if that's exactly backward? What if they saw something most people don't? What if they understood that to do what they needed to do, to become what they needed to become, they required something more valuable than companionship? They required undivided attention to their own becoming. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because the world has convinced you that wanting solitude is selfish, that prioritizing your own growth, your own purpose, your own sovereignty is somehow a moral failing. That the highest good is to split yourself in half and give that half to someone else. But let me ask you something. Is it selfish to refuse to dilute your potential? Is it selfish to say, I have something to create that requires everything I am? Is it selfish to choose the path that makes you most fully yourself, even if that path doesn't include a +1? Nietzsche had this thought experiment. He called it eternal recurrence. The idea is simple. Imagine you had to live your exact life again, precisely as it is, every moment, every choice, every experience, repeated infinitely, forever. Most people recoil from this idea, because when they're honest, they're not living their life, they're living a script someone else wrote. The script says, get educated, get a career, get married, have children, retire, die. And somewhere in the middle of that, if you're lucky, maybe you squeeze in a hobby. But Nietzsche asks, what if you could say yes to eternal recurrence? What if your life was so authentically yours, so completely an expression of your will, that you'd be thrilled to live it again and again forever? And here's the thing, you can't say yes to that if you're living someone else's idea of what your life should be. You can't say yes to that if you've traded your sovereignty for security, your purpose for partnership, your becoming for belonging. Nietzsche wasn't against love. He was against the kind of love that diminishes you, the kind that makes you smaller, more domesticated, more housebroken. He called it the love of the neighbor, this thing where you sacrifice who you could be for who someone else needs you to be. And he talked about the Übermensch, the person who creates their own values instead of accepting the values handed to them. Now, people misunderstand this concept. They think it's about being a Superman, about dominating others. But it's not. It's about self-mastery. It's about becoming the author of your own existence. And here's what nobody tells you. You cannot become the Übermensch. You cannot create your own values. You cannot author your own existence if you're constantly negotiating that existence with another person. Because the moment you enter a traditional relationship, you accept a fundamental premise that your life is no longer entirely your own to direct. Your time becomes negotiable. Your priorities become shared. Your decisions require consensus. And slowly, gradually, almost invisibly, you begin to edit yourself. You smooth out the edges that might cause conflict. You moderate the ambitions that might threaten the relationship. You learn to want what's reasonable, what's practical, what keeps the peace. Schopenhauer understood this. He lived alone for most of his life, working in the mornings, walking in the afternoons, thinking in the evenings. He had no spouse to consult, no children to raise, no domestic drama to navigate. His time was entirely his own. His mind was entirely his own. And people called him a misanthrope, a misogynist, a bitter old man. But read his work. Read the depth of thought, the clarity of insight, the architectural beauty of his philosophy. That doesn't come from bitterness. That comes from undivided attention to truth. He wrote, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone. And if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. For it is only when he is alone that he is really free." Think about that. Really think about it. When you're alone, genuinely alone, not lonely but sovereign, you are free to think any thought, pursue any interest, explore any idea without justifying it to another consciousness. Your life becomes a laboratory of self-discovery rather than a negotiation table. And this is what Nietzsche meant by solitude being necessary for creation. Not isolation, not withdrawal from the world, but this fundamental sovereignty over your own attention, your own time, your own becoming. Einstein said something similar. He called it a kind of monasticism. He needed vast stretches of uninterrupted time to think the thoughts that would revolutionize physics. And while he was married, his letters reveal the cost. The constant tension between his need for solitude and the demands of domestic life. The way his work suffered when he had to be a husband and father rather than a mind pursuing truth. What the world calls loneliness, these people called workspace. What the world calls isolation, they called freedom. And what the world calls love, they often recognized as a beautiful cage. Now, let me tell you about the Stoics, because they understood something profound about human psychology. They understood that you only have control over one thing in this life. your own mind. Everything else, every single other thing, is outside your control. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in Rome, an emperor who commanded legions, spent his private moments writing meditations that reveal this truth. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And here's what's fascinating. Marcus Aurelius was married. He had obligations, duties, endless responsibilities. And you can feel in his writing the weight of it, the constant drain of managing other people's needs, other people's emotions, other people's expectations. He found peace only in those stolen moments of solitude, writing to himself, reminding himself of what mattered. And what he reminds himself of again and again is that true peace comes from within. That external circumstances, including relationships, cannot give you the tranquility you seek. Now imagine for a moment that Marcus Aurelius had been single. Imagine all that energy he spent navigating the complex emotional landscape of marriage and family. All those resources he poured into maintaining domestic harmony, redirected entirely toward his own philosophical development, his own governance, his own becoming. Would he have been a better emperor? Would his meditations have gone even deeper? We'll never know. But the question is worth asking. The Stoics had this concept, memento mori. Remember that you will die, not as morbid obsession, but as liberation. You have finite time, finite attention, finite energy. Every moment you spend managing someone else's emotional weather is a moment you're not spending on your own development, your own purpose, your own confrontation with mortality. And in a relationship, so much energy goes toward this management. Your partner had a bad day, you absorb it. They're anxious about something, you soothe it. They need reassurance, you provide it. And none of this is wrong, exactly. But it's a choice to direct your limited resources outward rather than inward. Epictetus, who was enslaved before becoming a philosopher, understood freedom in a way most free people never do. He said that freedom isn't having what you want, it's wanting only what you already have. And the ultimate freedom is needing nothing from anyone, including their approval, their company, their love. The single person who has embraced this Stoic wisdom doesn't avoid relationships because they're afraid of them. They avoid them because they've tasted something more valuable than what relationships offer. They've tasted self-sufficiency. They've tasted the profound peace that comes from not needing anything from anyone. And there's a story about Socrates that reveals something important. Socrates was married to Xanthippe, who by all accounts was difficult, demanding, sharp-tempered. People asked him why he stayed with her, and he said it was good practice. That dealing with her trained him in patience, the way a horseman trains with difficult horses. Now, think about what he's saying. He's saying his marriage was training, not joy, not fulfillment, not completion. Training, an exercise in endurance. Is that what you want your most intimate relationship to be? A prolonged exercise in managing difficulty? And before you say, well, Socrates was being humble, remember this. Socrates spent most of his time in the marketplace talking to young men, pursuing philosophical truth. He was rarely home. His real life, his real love, was philosophy. The marriage was incidental. The Stoics understood that peace, real peace, is non-negotiable. You cannot compromise it away and call it love. You cannot trade it for security and call it wisdom. Peace comes from self-mastery, and self-mastery requires focused attention that partnership inherently divides. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Let's talk about the existentialists, because they understood something terrifying and liberating at the same time. They understood that you are radically, absolutely, terrifyingly free. Sartre said we are condemned to freedom. Condemned, not blessed, because freedom is heavy. When you're truly free, you have no excuses. You cannot blame your circumstances, your upbringing, your partner. You are the author of your existence, and that authorship is a burden most people desperately want to escape. And do you know what the most popular escape is? Marriage, partnership, commitment. Because the moment you commit to another person, You have a perfect excuse for every choice you make, every path you don't take, every dream you don't pursue. I would have started that business, but my partner needs stability. I would have moved to that city, but we have a life here. I would have taken that risk, but I have to think about us. See how easy that is? See how the burden of freedom dissolves into the comfortable warmth of shared responsibility? You're no longer alone in the terrifying expanse of possibility. You have a companion in the cage. But the existentialist said that authentic existence requires you to face that expanse without flinching, to create yourself, moment by moment, through choices that are entirely your own. And this is nearly impossible to do in a traditional relationship because every major choice becomes a negotiation, a compromise, a dilution of pure will. Emily Dickinson understood this. She rarely left her house, never married, spent her days writing poems that wouldn't be recognized until after her death. And people said she was agoraphobic, antisocial, afraid of life. But read her poems. They're not the words of someone afraid of life. They're the words of someone who chose inner depth over outer breadth, who chose the infinite space of her own consciousness over the finite connections of society. She wrote, "The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. Not because the soul is cruel, but because the soul knows that depth requires protection, that true creation requires boundaries, that sovereignty requires solitude." Camus talked about rebellion, about refusing to accept the absurdity of existence, about creating meaning through defiant choice. And the ultimate rebellion, in a world that demands you partner up and settle down, is to say, no, I will remain sovereign. I will remain free. I will remain uncompromised. Because here's what nobody tells you about existential freedom. It's lonely. Not the loneliness of wanting company, but the loneliness of standing in a place most people refuse to go. The loneliness of making choices that have no safety net, no shared responsibility, no one to blame if it goes wrong. Henry David Thoreau went to Walden Pond to live deliberately, to strip away everything unnecessary and discover what was essential to being human. And you know what wasn't essential? Partnership, companionship, romance. He lived alone, worked alone, thought alone. And in that aloneness, he found something most people never find. Himself, unedited, undiluted, unconcealed. He wrote, "I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude." Not because he hated people, but because he discovered that the conversation with yourself, when it's honest and deep, is more nourishing than most conversations with others. And this is what the existentialists understood. That authentic existence, existence that is truly your own, requires you to face the void alone. Not because you're antisocial, but because the void, the abyss of freedom, is where you actually find out who you are beneath all the roles and performances. And a relationship, almost by definition, is a performance. You perform the role of partner. You negotiate your authentic impulses against the needs of the relationship. You cannot scream into the void with someone else holding your hand. You cannot confront the fundamental absurdity of existence while worrying about whether you're meeting someone else's emotional needs. The existential hero, the one who creates meaning in a meaningless universe, does so alone. Not because they want to be alone, but because authentic creation cannot be a committee project. Now, Carl Jung would have something to say about all this. Because Jung understood that the idea of finding completion in another person is not just wrong, it's psychologically destructive. We have this mythology, this poisonous fairy tale, that somewhere out there is your other half, your soulmate, the person who completes you. And Jung would laugh at this. He'd say, "You want completion? Look inward, not outward." Jung talked about the process of individuation, the process of becoming whole, not by adding another person, but by integrating the aspects of yourself you've disowned or projected onto others. Every man carries within him the feminine, what Jung called the anima, and every woman carries within her the masculine, the animus. And what happens in most relationships? Instead of integrating these internal energies, you project them. The man projects his anima onto his partner. expecting her to carry all the emotional, intuitive, nurturing qualities he refuses to develop in himself. And she projects her animus onto him, expecting him to carry all the assertive, rational, decisive qualities she hasn't owned. And they both remain half-developed, fragmented, incomplete, each using the other as a prosthetic for the parts of themselves they haven't integrated. Jung said that true individuation, true psychological wholeness, requires you to withdraw these projections, to stop expecting another person to carry aspects of yourself, to develop your own emotional intelligence, your own intuition, your own capacity for both masculine and feminine energies. And this is brutally difficult to do in a relationship, because relationships thrive on these projections. They feel like love, this sense that the other person completes you. But it's not love. It's dependency masquerading as intimacy. The single person who understands Jungian psychology has an enormous advantage. They are forced to confront their own shadow, their own rejected qualities. Directly, there's no one else to blame, no one else to project onto. The anger, the fear, the sadness, the parts of yourself you don't like, you have to face them alone, integrate them alone, own them alone. And in that process, something remarkable happens. You actually become whole, not half a person looking for their other half, but an integrated being who contains both masculine and feminine, both light and shadow, both strength and vulnerability. Jung talked about archetypes: the warrior, the king, the magician, the lover, and in a relationship, these archetypes get compromised. The warrior cannot pursue his battles because he has to consider his partner's comfort. The king cannot rule his domain because he has to negotiate sovereignty. The magician cannot explore the depths because he has to be emotionally available. The lover cannot embrace life fully because he's supposed to save that embrace for one person. But the single person, their archetypes develop purely, without compromise. The warrior fights the battles that matter to him. The king governs his life with absolute authority. The magician dives into the mysteries without answering to anyone. The lover loves all of existence, not just one person. And Jung said something profound. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who someone else needs you to be, not who a relationship requires you to be, who you truly are. And that becoming, that individuation, is not a group project. It's the loneliest, most solitary journey you can take. But it's also the only journey that actually matters. Now, let me tell you about something most people don't want to hear. Let me tell you about power, real power. Not money, not influence, not social status, strategic power. The power to act without revealing your hand, to move without being predicted, to create without being constrained. Machiavelli understood this. Real power requires opacity. It requires the ability to keep your own counsel, to guard your intentions, to operate from a position of mystery. And marriage is fundamentally incompatible with this kind of power, because in a relationship, you become transparent. Your partner knows your weaknesses, your fears, your strategies. They know what keeps you up at night. They know what you care about most. And the moment someone knows these things, you become predictable, controllable, exploitable. Sun Tzu said, all warfare is based on deception. And while we're not talking about warfare here, we are talking about navigating a world that doesn't have your best interests at heart. A world where your vulnerabilities will be used against you, where your attachments become leverage, where your loves become weaknesses. The single person is a ghost in the machine. Their motivations are private, their plans are secret, their resources are entirely their own. They can pivot without explanation, disappear without apology, strike without warning. They owe no one an account of their movements. But the partnered person, they're tethered. They have someone they love, and that love is an exploitable weakness. They have someone who knows them, and that knowledge is a liability. They have someone who expects certain behaviors, and those expectations are chains. Florence Nightingale understood this. She was proposed to multiple times by men of means and standing, and she refused them all because she had a mission to revolutionize nursing and public health. And she knew with crystal clarity that if she married, that mission would be diluted, compromised, made secondary to domestic duties. She chose strategic solitude. She chose the opacity that allowed her to move through male-dominated systems without the obvious vulnerability of a husband and children, and she changed the world because of it. Elizabeth I did the same. The Virgin Queen, they called her, and she weaponized her single status, using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool while never actually surrendering her sovereignty. She said, "I am married to England," and England flourished under her rule in ways it never would have if she'd divided her attention. Tesla never married. He said marriage would interfere with his work, and people mocked him for it, called him strange, obsessive. But Tesla literally electrified the world. His inventions power your life right now. That doesn't come from a divided mind. That comes from singular focus. Virginia Woolf wrote about needing a room of one's own, a space where a woman could think, create, exist without interruption. And while she was married, her most profound observation was that women throughout history had been denied this room, this sovereign space, by the demands of marriage and family. And what's true for women has always been true for anyone who wants to create something that matters. You need undivided attention, uninterrupted time, sovereign space, and traditional relationships are designed, almost perfectly, to deny you exactly these things. Now, Nietzsche said something that most people misunderstand. He talked about the loneliness of the great soul, and people think he meant that great people are sad and isolated. But that's not it at all. He meant that when you refuse to live at the intellectual and emotional level of the masses, when you insist on thinking deeper, feeling more intensely, creating more daringly, you necessarily separate yourself, not because you're better than others, but because you're operating in a different dimension. And this separation, this chosen solitude, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's the price of admission to the realm where real creation happens, where real thought occurs, where real power is cultivated. Most people never pay this price. They stay in the comfortable shallows of conventional life, surrounded by others who are also wading in the shallows, and they call it community. They call it love. They call it a life well lived. But the person who has touched something deeper, who has tasted the strange joy of sovereign existence, can never go back to those shallows. The water there is too warm, too safe, too thoroughly explored. So here's what I want you to understand. Staying single, choosing solitude, maintaining your sovereignty, it's not about being damaged or antisocial or afraid. It's about recognizing that you have one life, one shot at becoming who you actually are. And that shot requires resources most people freely give away. It requires time that isn't negotiated, attention that isn't divided, energy that isn't spent managing another person's emotional landscape, space that isn't shared, silence that isn't interrupted. And yes, you lose something. You lose the comfort of companionship. You lose the security of shared responsibility. You lose the social approval that comes with partnering up. You lose the easy story that makes sense to everyone else. But what do you gain? You gain yourself, undiluted, uncompromised, unedited. You gain the freedom to wake up every morning and ask, what do I want to create today? Without having to add, that my partner will also be okay with. You gain the ability to take risks that don't risk anyone else's security, to fail without dragging someone else down with you, to succeed without having to share credit or resources. You gain the strange, lonely joy of knowing that your life is entirely your own construction, that you have no one to blame and no one to thank, that you are the sole author of your existence. And this isn't for everyone. Most people would rather have the comfort of partnership than the burden of sovereignty. Most people would rather share the journey than walk alone. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a legitimate choice. But if you're someone who feels the pull towards something deeper, something more focused, something more purely your own, if you're someone who looks at the conventional path and feels not desire but claustrophobia, then maybe staying single isn't a consolation prize. Maybe it's exactly what you need. Maybe the loneliness you fear is actually solitude. Maybe the isolation you've been taught to avoid is actually sovereignty. Maybe the thing everyone says you're missing is actually the thing that would dilute everything you're meant to become. The spiritually awake can't find love because they've already found something more important. They've found themselves. And once you find that, once you taste that depth of self-knowledge and self-possession, everything else looks like a distraction. The person who chooses strategic solitude isn't running from connection. They're running toward creation. They're not avoiding intimacy. They're avoiding dilution. They're not scared of commitment. They're committed to something bigger than partnership. They're committed to becoming fully, completely, uncompromisingly themselves. And in a world that constantly tells you that you need another person to be whole, this is the most radical act imaginable. To say, no, I am already whole. I am already complete. I am already free. And if you never find another person who understands that, who operates at that level, who has also chosen sovereignty over security, you still have the sovereignty itself. You still have the freedom. You still have the undivided life. And that's not a consolation prize. That's the whole game. That's the entire point. Because the greatest love story isn't finding someone else. It's the one between you and the life you're brave enough to live on your own terms. You are not half a person waiting to be doubled. You are the entire equation. You are the fire and the forge. You are the sculptor and the marble. You are the author who writes and the story being written. And you don't need anyone's permission to start living like it. This is the secret that history's greatest creators knew. This is the power that history's greatest minds wielded. This is the life that history's greatest souls chose. And it's available to you. Right now, today, the moment you stop looking for completion in someone else and start recognizing that sovereignty was never something you needed to find. It was something you needed to stop giving away. So yes, stay single. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. Because you've done the math and realized that what you gain, undivided time, uncompromised energy, unedited selfhood, is worth infinitely more than what you lose. Because you've tasted freedom, real freedom. And nothing, no relationship, no partnership, no promise of security can compare to that.